everyone, I'm Kevin, otherwise known as Forum BX257, your friendly neighborhood 1980s and 90s G.I. Joe toy reviewer. And October marks my 10th anniversary on YouTube doing vintage G.I. Joe videos. And to mark this special occasion, I'm going to be taking a look at the G.I. Joe team's first sergeant, Duke. Now, Duke is obviously the most recognizable face of the G.I. Joe franchise, but more importantly to me, and why I chose him for my 10th anniversary video, he is also one of my top 10 favorite G.I. Joe action figures. Now, Duke makes his first comic book appearance in the Old Marvel comic run of G.I. Joe in issue number 22, and makes his first animated appearance in the Sunbow animated 5-part miniseries in 1983, G.I. Joe: A Real American Hero, or as most people would call it today, G.I. Joe: The Mass Device, in Part 1. Now, I'll admit, when I first did a G.I. Joe Duke review, like 5 or 6 years ago, or might have been even longer than that, I didn't quite understand why he was named Duke. I knew it had something to do with John Wayne, because that was his famous nickname, John the Duke Wayne. But it wasn't until I saw a few of John Wayne's movies that I kind of understood why he was given that code name, because that is pretty much Duke's attitude. On his file card, well, I'm going to paraphrase this terribly, but he says that he just wants to be, a sergeant, not an officer, even though he has a tremendous amount of experience. He should be promoted well into the officer range, but he stays as a sergeant just so that he can stay with the rest of his corps or his unit. Basically all the grunts. He wants to stay with them. In case that anything goes wrong, he is with them, and he is not an officer on the sideline explaining why all the grunts are hurt or captured or whatever. And that is definitely a John Wayne attitude. Although most collectors would list Duke as a 1984 action figure, he is first released in 1983 as a mail-away. Now, the mail-away had several interesting things. First of all, there is an early and later version of the 1983 mail-away. Here, I actually have the earliest version. Unfortunately, mine is just sealed in the package here, and I'm not likely to take him out anytime soon. But among his accessories is actually a standard 1982 style G.I. Joe helmet. But one thing that was very unique to the figure was the fact that there were no ear holes. Another thing that the early version came with is a little US flag here. Now, oddly enough, Hasbro would phase out those two things during the lifetime of just the 1983 release of the mail-away. So sometimes you will find 1983 mail-aways, but with a helmet that has the ear holes. And sometimes you will find a figure which did not come with the sticker. And sometimes they would be like mixed and matched. Sometimes you'll find the sticker but with ear holes, or one without the ear holes but no sticker, and those would be legit releases. Hasbro was very inconsistent with how they phased out those two things. Here's an example of another Duke mail-away form. This one was normally in stores, kind of like a coupon book on the shelves, where you would have to sort of rip it off at the perforation and take it home with you. The other thing that was unique to the mail-away version of Duke was his file card, or more or less the look of the file card, which was not changed during the lifetime of the 1983 run. And while the information on the file card is the same as all subsequent releases of the 1984 style Duke action figure, it's actually his portrait, this sort of very close-up of his face, which was unique to the mail-away. All other versions would have more of a standard bust style portrait in that spot. Now, this is what I would consider to be the standard Duke action figure, and we'll take a look at his accessories, starting off with his aforementioned helmet. This, of course, is just the standard 82 and 83 design helmet for the G.I. Joes. The coloring is exactly the same as you would find on a Steeler figure or this Zap figure. Next, he comes with his only armament, what the contents list on the card calls the M32 submachine gun. Now, the gun is a remold of the gun which came with Stalker here. Now Stalker's gun was called the M32 Pulverizer, and this one's just called M32, but there is no designation in the US armaments as a M32. This is clearly an MP5 from the Heckler & Koch line. However, it is a very early variant. You don't really see these anymore today with the straight stick mag here. They're usually curved. Of course, this is a full stock, but skeletonized. Usually you see that just the L-shaped stock on MP5s. Next, he comes with his only unique accessory, and that is his binocular. They are jet black, and Duke only ever came with jet black binoculars. And finally, he came with a backpack. His airborne backpack, in fact, that's what it's called. And one thing which is always very interesting with the Duke figure and his backpack is that a lot of people interchange it with the one from the 1983 Airborne. They do look very, very similar. As a matter of fact, I'm not even sure you can even pick this out in the video, but they are, in fact, slightly different colors. The tan used on Airborne here is a very, very pale, whereas Duke has a very warm, almost caramel color. Another difference you can tell between the two is that while they are clearly the same mold, they actually aren't. You can see Airborne actually has this little cross in the middle here. Duke's accessories aren't the only things that are largely borrowed from other action figures. His body parts are too. His lower legs are actually borrowed from a 1983 Gung Ho. His upper legs, however, are borrowed from the 1983 Major Blood. Very strange, and really do look very different the way they're colored. And of course, both his arms, waist, and his back portion are borrowed from the 1983 Doc figure. It's just fascinating to me how Duke could be a mishmash of so many different figures and accessories and yet look so good with or without his accessories. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. The 82 figures were designed to be interchangeable with a minimum amount of parts. However, I just don't feel that that's the way that Duke was originally designed. Despite the fact that, I mean, let's face it, he has a unique head and a unique chest, but it goes so seamlessly well with so many very unique parts. Taking a closer look at Duke, or more specifically his head and chest sculpt, because those are the more unique parts of this action figure, I have to say that I really love his smiling face. And that's coming from someone who generally doesn't like frozen expressions on their action figures, specifically G.I. Joes, because generally when you have a big goofy grin or smile on the face, it's really hard to pose them in a combat way. But here, I think it is really appropriate for Duke because he has a really small smile. It's very friendly. It's very welcoming almost. And that to me is really just his role as a leader, not just as a fighter. I mean, you look at him and you think, well, that's a friendly guy. He's the good guy. He's the quintessential hero. And that's all really just expressed with his expression. And I think that's pretty cool. One very interesting thing about his chest sculpt, and this is rather unfortunate because, well, very soon afterwards they have sharper sculpt for this particular thing. And that is his like little gold symbol here, which is supposed to be the parachute wings. It's really unfortunate that it's really so stylized on this particular Duke. It looks like just a bunch of like triangles. Here you can see the what they meant to go with here. You can see the parachute with the wings on there. Another very interesting thing about the card art is that you can really see that he is prominently holding what looks like the XMLR-3A laser rifle, which would have originally come with the 1983 Snow Job, but just done in green. And I'm not really sure why they switched it over to Stalker's M32, other than the fact that I think around this time Stalker was just going to go out of production. Stalker would have still been available in 84, but certainly not in 85, whereas Snow Job would have been released in 83, 84, and 85. So maybe they just didn't want another figure with the same weapon on the racks at the same time. Duke isn't one of my favorite figures just because he is a prominent leader or a prominent character for G.I. Joe, but because he is also a really good action figure on top of all of that. Now, he has what I would consider the standard for what an army figure should have: a backpack, a helmet, and some large combat weapon. In this case, the submachine gun, but it could very easily be mistaken for a combat rifle as well. Now, on top of that, he also has the binoculars, which you might think that I would leave off the figure sometimes, but I really don't, because as you can see, you can actually kind of just raise them up close to his head, and he doesn't even have to hold them in order for it to look like he's looking through his binoculars. Very good for recon, very good for intelligence gathering, and very good for, well, instilling the idea that he is a commander, but also a field commander specifically. He just has a really nice blend of colors here as well. The top portion being tan with some green on it, and the bottom portion being green but with some brown on it, just sort of echoing the tan that's on top of here. Honestly, despite the fact that I think the tan with the, I guess the shirt inside of a shirt thing going on here, because you can see the green undershirt sort of poking out, I think that was meant to evoke the early, I guess, airborne colors, usually having a brown coat over the green outfit. But I think that he looks really good as a modern figure. Like, he still kind of looks modern, to be perfectly honest. And here is Duke with his fellow field commanders of the G.I. Joe team. Now, Duke is supposed to take over those command duties from Colonel Hawk, who was then promoted to General. And he was supposed to be superseded by Flint, who really was only prominent for 1 year before General Hawk came back and replaced him as field commander once again. Now, if you're more familiar with the comic books, you know that General Hawk was a very prominent character. And Duke was really only prominent for the first year that he was introduced, and then he sort of faded away, and basically, well, General Hawk sort of fills in the role that Duke should have. But if you're more familiar with the cartoon, and I think the cartoon was way more influential than the comic books, rather unfortunately, the fact of the matter is that most people really more recognize Duke than they do General Hawk. So much so that even though General Hawk starts off as Colonel Hawk and a blonde character, you can see that the updated version, where these two are supposed to really stand side by side, you can see they changed his hair to brown, so as not for kids to mistake him for another version of Duke. So just who is Duke's opposite number on the Cobra side? Well, as G.I. Joe's prominent field commander, you would think that I would pair him off against Cobra Commander himself. But I tend to think of him as being more of an opposite number, not to Duke as a field commander, but really Hawk as, well, basically the team's general. So really his opposite number should be then Cobra Commander's right-hand man, Destro, who was really introduced as more of a field commander for the Cobra side. However, as Duke was actually introduced in 1984, I actually tend to think of, well, Cobra Commander again, or most specifically, the hooded Cobra Commander version of him. As I've already explained, Duke is first available as a mail away from Hasbro in 1983, and then released in 1984 for general retail on a regular card like this. But that's not the end of the first version's Duke's history, oddly enough. In the same year of 1984, we get this. A JC Penney 3-pack. This is the 6/188 assortment featuring Duke, Snow Job, and Blowtorch. And this is where you get the file card with a red back on it, but with the full portrait. It's almost like the mail-away file card. Then in 1985, we get a re-release of the carded version for general retail. But But in the same year, we get a uniquely packaged Duke, which almost looks like a driver figure, with the bubbles being on more or less on the side, and the card being basically the back of the bubble itself. Now this came with the Family Home Entertainment video cassette of the very first G.I. Joe miniseries, which was condensed into a movie. This was a very expensive tape back in 1985, so to sweeten the deal, they vacuum sealed this carded driver-like Duke onto the back of the video cassettes. The VCR Duke's file card looks very much like the JC Penney file card, where it has the full portrait of Duke, but the mail-away style framing around it. But unlike the JC Penney version, it doesn't have a number like the 6188 number off in the corner. It's just blank. With so much information about classic G.I. Joe history on the internet, and specifically researchers like myself and other collectors filling in little gaps in history, you would think that there isn't any mysteries out there for the G.I. Joe figures, or specifically a popular action figure like Duke. But there is. There is a mystery, and I just can't wrap my head around it. Maybe you out there have your own theories, or maybe you have a part of the puzzle which I really need here, because one of the mysteries with Duke is long sleeves Duke. Now, long sleeve Duke is, well, rather obviously, a variant of the mold. Everything else on the figure is exactly the same, except for his arms here. You can see that the shirt goes all the way down to his wrists. You can't see any of his wrists there. Another thing which is different is the waist piece, which is completely different. The waist piece on a long sleeve Duke is that of a Cobra soldier or Cobra officer from 82 or 83. Now here, it may be a little bit hard to see, but the copyright says made in Hong Kong, meaning that this was made prior to the 1990s. And that is significant because there is a variant of the first version of Duke made for the Chinese market. It was not a bootleg or anything like that. A lot of people claim that it's a bootleg, but it was a G.I. Joe meant for the Chinese market. It was never meant to be exported into North America, and looks very much like this. That figure had 1988 hit and runs lower arms, which actually did have cuffs very similar to this, but they were higher up on his arm. He also had the same type of waist exactly, but that would say made in China, not made in Hong Kong. This one is pretty much unique, and it only shows up in two formats. The first time I've ever seen a long sleeve Duke was from Japan. In Japan, they released G.I. Joe starting in 1986. And while most Japanese Dukes look like this, there is a number of them which also look like this. But here's where things get kind of weird. Yeah, it was released in 1986, and you can say that they had used the Duke mold for so long, and you can imagine it breaking, and some parts have to get replaced. So at the end of the 1986 run, you get this weird variant of Duke, just so that they still have a Duke. The weird thing is that some North American packaged G.I. Joe Dukes in this version have popped up, but in 1984 carded Duke packaging. A lot of collectors say that, well, that must be an original Duke which has had its mold damaged, so they have to replace it with this. But Duke was re-released in 1985, looking like a standard Duke. Out of like 20, 30 years of collecting, I've only ever seen two examples of a long sleeve Duke put on North American packaging, and it's always 1984 packaging, not 1985. That, to me, suggests that nothing was wrong with the mold. This was just something which they had done halfway through their original run of the figure in the factory. I don't really understand why Hasbro would go to all the trouble of making a brand new arm here, just for, like, the middle of the 1984 run. That to me doesn't make much sense. There is the prevailing theory also that it wasn't the Duke mold which got damaged, but it was actually the Doc mold that got damaged. And Doc was released in 83 and 84 only, which means that if you went back and like took some parts from Duke just to make Doc, then you have to make Duke out of somebody. But of course, you're going to go back and make more Dukes because he's more popular, and he's going to be released in 1985. So that's why you get the original Duke back again. That's an interesting theory. Another weird little theory which I came up with was those two samples are so rare and so out of place time-wise that they might not have been meant for retail. So one of these sample figures, which could have been just randomly on a 1984 card and meant to be given to either Takara or Japanese retailers to, see what the G.I. Joes are all about, because they might not know. And that may be where this has come from. Change molds were given to Japan specifically. And I think that's maybe where the two examples of the ones which I've seen on the North American card were really just meant as sales samples. But what do you think? What do you think is the mystery? Is there a mystery? Or is it just Hasbro being Hasbro and being inconsistent with their parts and their quality? If you're looking for a Duke action figure on the aftermarket, while he is, to me, a fairly common figure to find, even his parts are fairly common just to find by themselves. So if you're trying to build a figure, it's fairly easy to do. Unfortunately, he is an incredibly popular figure, so his value is quite high on the aftermarket right now. That's rather unfortunate, because I think that no G.I. Joe collection, or in fact no 1980s toy collection, is really complete without this guy. Now, there is at least one thing that you do have to look out for. Well, maybe two. One of them is, of course, the strap on his binoculars. While they're normally quite strong, they can be broken, and you do have to look out for that. Another thing, too, is the plastic, especially the green plastic on this figure, is like a lot of green plastic from earlier Hasbro figures like Zap or Steeler or Stalker. They all have a very brittle light green plastic, and that results in Duke's crotch often being broken. So that's something you have to look out for. Unfortunately, a lot of enterprising people, after the thing breaks off, they just swap it with another person's waist piece. I've seen like Chuckle's waist piece being in here, and it looks so normal being in there that you might just overlook it. So you do have to make absolutely sure that is the proper Duke waist piece. But yeah, this is an expensive figure, but I think it's kind of worth it because, like I said, he is the face of G.I. Joe and a really good action figure on top of that. Back box came from the same chest legs as Grunt here. That's not. Here is Duke with his fellow. Well, that's all the time I have right now. Please check out my Facebook page for more information and behind the scenes photos for these reviews. Thank you for watching this video, and stay tuned for next time to see another 1980s G.I. Joe toy review. See you then.